Welcome, folks. Welcome. I'm going to kick things off very quickly and not take any of the speakers' time from the allotted start time. My name's Steve Wilson. I'm the Privacy, Ethics and Public Policy track lead for Identiverse, along with Brenda Leong, who's probably not in this session. But as track leads, we're all trying to introduce our speakers and support them properly. You've got three people today from an innovative law and advisory firm, Venable. A lot of people from Venable at the conference. You should listen to what they've got to say. They're deep thinkers about this stuff. The bios are in the pack. I'm just going to summarise by saying that Jamie and Ivy and Zach, between them, have 50 years' experience across industry and government. Some of them have contributed to the chapters on privacy in SP 800-63 and the NIST privacy framework. So these people have written the stuff, they're implementing the stuff, and they're going to give you some really practical advice crossed into security practice. So I think that one of the hardest things we've got is to make privacy accessible to security professionals and vice versa. And we've got to stop this sort of silo approach, or this assumption that the lawyers have got privacy worked out. These people are tech sophisticated lawyers, let's put it that way, and I think that you're going to learn how to relate to this thing called privacy. Over to you.
Is this on? Yes. All right. Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. I'm Jamie Danker. I'm a Senior Director of Privacy and Cybersecurity Services at Venable, which is a law firm. However, none of us here, sitting here, are actually attorneys. So my first disclaimer today, because lawyers don't get the monopoly on disclaimers, is that what we're presenting today should not be construed as legal advice. We're going to share some anecdotes from our collective over 50 years of experience, which is older than any single person here on the stage. Amazing, right? We're so young. Yeah, so brief background on myself, and I'll pass it over to Ivy and then to Zach. And I have about 20 years of privacy and cybersecurity experience. Good chunk of that experience was in public service. Started my career off at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, where I audited privacy programs. Flipped over to the operational side of the house and spent about 10 years at the Department of Homeland Security in various places there, building their privacy compliance infrastructure at the programmatic level as a privacy officer. And then my last stint there, I was the chief privacy officer for what's now the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. And as Steve mentioned, too, worked with NIST on the digital identity guidelines, privacy requirements and considerations. And when I left government about 5 years ago, supported NIST in developing the NIST privacy framework, and now at Venable, I focus my practice on privacy and helping organizations build better privacy programs using strong privacy risk management practices. Now I'll pass it over to Ivy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Intro to Privacy today. I'm Ivy Orecchio, and I'm a project manager with Venable, also not an attorney. I have advanced degrees in public affairs and cybersecurity, and I'm also a certified information privacy manager through the International Association of Privacy Professionals, or the IAPP. My background really is in federal government privacy, but I've been working with state and local governments and also private sector and nonprofit sector organizations as they worked to develop and implement their own privacy programs. So I'm looking forward to discussing privacy and personal data with you today.
And hi, I'm Zach Martin. I'm a senior policy advisor at Venable. Been with the team for about 1.5 years at this point, helping run the Better Identity Coalition and support a variety of different clients. Prior to that, I was in consulting, supporting state and federal agencies. And actually, prior to that, I was a journalist in the field, having written about biometrics and identity for more than 12 years. But yeah, I contribute about 20 years experience as well. So look forward to the conversation today.
All right. So just quick pulse check. How do you identify professionally? How many people here consider themselves privacy professionals? All right. Great. All right. We got some people who can join the stage or who will definitely help in leading the interactive exercise at the end. Cybersecurity. Okay. ICAM. Any engineers in the room? Yay. Okay, we love the engineers. Policy. Okay, and some of you, I'm sure you can raise your hand more than once too. Legal. Oh, Christine Owen, of course, is in the audience to check us. How many just consider themselves wearing a different hat? Okay, and how many people just don't want to be labeled? I mean, that's fair. That's totally fair. So we've got a good mix. I think there's a little bit of something for everyone here. Remember that it's an intro to privacy class. We only have 50 minutes, so we're going to try to breeze through these slides really quickly. The agenda, basically, we're going to go over some background, why does privacy matter, a little bit about the global regulatory landscape. You'll notice we are big NIST fans. For those who don't know in the room, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it's an agency of commerce. It's a non-regulatory agency, made a lot of risk management frameworks, including the cybersecurity and privacy framework. So a lot of anecdotes we'll be talking about are related to NIST, but there are many other global standards out there, such as ISO, but we will be focusing mostly on NIST today. We'll go through fair information practice principles and some practical guidance on how you see those in action and some do's and don'ts. And then last, we'll have an interactive exercise at the end for you all to participate. Next slide. Handing it over to Ivy.
All right, so intro to privacy. Let's get down to the basics. First and foremost, what is privacy? Like, it is a deceptively complex concept. It has implications in everything from home security all the way to healthcare and everything in between. So really simply put, we're going to talk about information privacy today, which is anything regarding the collection, use, processing, and retention of personal data throughout the data lifecycle and protection of that data as well. So with that definition comes another term, personal data. You may have also heard terms like personal information, or our favorite in the federal sector, PII, personally identifiable information. Our definition today is also going to remain broad, thinking of information about an individual that can be used to directly or indirectly identify them. So looking at some of these basic building blocks, we've got things like your name, contact information, numerical identifiers, and personal characteristics. These are the typical data elements that I think most of us would look at and say, yes, that is about a person. I really want to draw your attention to the last point on the screen. Other information that is linked or linkable to an individual. Sometimes we call these indirect identifiers, and in privacy we like to think of it as a mosaic effect. Seemingly harmless pieces of information that don't look necessarily like a particular person, that when you put it all together, take a few steps back, and it can create a very vivid image. I think we're taking questions at the very end.
Okay. I was just going to say, get an example of that, but that's fine.
I'm trying to think, what are some of the best, even something as simple as age. It's just a number on a screen, or just a list of, what is a good?
I'm trying to think. Well, I can think of, one, like, we're going to talk about regulatory landscape, but healthcare, and the healthcare sector, there's the thing is protected health information. So there was recently new guidance from Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights that was directed at using identifiers for tracking. That typically was not considered protected health information under HIPAA, but this new guidance from Health and Human Services, OCR, kind of put it under that PHI category. So this included things like IP address and other identifiers that might not have been considered PHI under HIPAA previously.
So think of it as those data elements that when you add context, it might even change the sensitivity. So a list of a few names might not be very sensitive until you put top secret super spy at the very top of the list. That all of a sudden becomes a little bit more sensitive. But why does it actually matter? Why are we talking about personal data? Why are we talking about privacy? First, we're building consumer trust. We're all people in this room. We all have our own personal data, and we all have our own privacy preferences. So the choices that I make about my personal data are probably a little bit different than the choices that you might make regarding yours. But generally, customers like doing repeat business with the companies that they can trust. And that trust can be turned into revenue. So building customer trust is that first piece. The second thing we need to consider is, what are we protecting our companies from? Reputational harm, for one. We definitely want to stay out of the headlines. And also breaking customer trust by being irresponsible with personal data, it may not just result in losing their business. You might lose clients, you might lose business partnerships, and the general public at large. Another thing we're protecting from is non-compliance. We are not attorneys, but one thing you don't want to do is break the law. You may face fines, you may have to increase your spending and allocate larger portions of your budget to privacy and security safeguards. And that's just not good for business overall when you're having to spend more just to prevent things from happening again. You may also have to face increased oversight from government or regulators if you're not protecting personal data adequately. But privacy is not always these negative things that we have to protect against problems. There's risk involved in every single design decision and business decision being made. So let's think of privacy similarly. If we're making these privacy decisions and making decisions based on risk, that can be a business enabler and it can be your competitive advantage. So thinking of what are consumers saying? This slide shows that nearly over two-thirds of customers say that they're concerned about their online privacy. From a business perspective, it would not be very wise to ignore what the vast majority of consumers are saying. I think this number will probably only grow, especially as technology is inextricably linked to our daily lives, and more legislation keeps coming out that targets different types of technologies and the uses of personal data. But why do consumers care? We need to think about not just the harms that we can do to our companies if personal data is not handled well. We need to think about the harms to individuals. Even well-meaning businesses that have really great products need to be concerned about privacy harms. It's not just about hackers and people stealing data. It can also be the data actions that we're taking in pursuit of something good that can cause a problem. So think of financial harms to individuals, things like identity theft, but also reputational harm. What if you're making poor decisions about individuals by using outdated or inaccurate information? You can also cause emotional harms if you have sensitive data that is revealed or disclosed to someone who shouldn't have that information. And there's also the potential for physical harms, such as stalking. So think of a product like an AirTag. It was created to help us keep track of our things, but it can also be misused for something like surveillance or stalking. If it's placed into a vehicle or a bag that someone doesn't know about by someone they know or don't know, it can cause some serious dangers to people. But back to those perceptions from some of our consumers. Over 35%, so more than a third, think that legal compliance is the biggest motivating factor for companies to make decisions around personal data and privacy. Some of these other stats, 20% believe that privacy decisions are being made to improve a corporate reputation. 14% is the key to competitive advantage. And only 10% think that privacy choices are being made because they align with corporate values. That is not a great outlook. But these are just perceptions. You, your companies, your products, the way that you're making privacy decisions, that can be the thing that changes these perceptions for the better.
Thanks, Ivy. And I think, honestly, like all those are valid reasons why companies should care about privacy, but you could have multiple selections. We often do assessments for clients using the NIST privacy framework, and we recently had one client that they wanted to improve their consumer trust, improve communication within their company about privacy. And of course, the largest reason companies want to do assessments is they want to show that they're complying with laws and regulations. But turning to digital identity, which is why we're pretty much all here for this conference today, why does it matter in digital identity? Kind of going back to what Steve said in the beginning here, sometimes from the security perspective, we think that digital identity is really just all about ensuring the right person gets access to the data. And I think, that's one part of privacy that kind of is in the intersection of cyber and privacy when you're talking about confidentiality. But that's really only one side of the equation. You're collecting a lot of information through the identity proofing process. And if you're not thinking about how you're managing that data, you can create a lot of privacy risks. So these are some choice quotes from the Digital Identity Guidelines, 863. Revision 3 is the one on the left. And then the right is from the draft revision 4, where you see that privacy needs to be considered along with other objectives, including equity, usability, and other indicators of mission and business performance. Next slide, please. Okay, so next we're going to go through the fair information practice principles. I'm not going to go through all these on one slide because that would take forever. What we're going to try to do is just really break down the principles. These are the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, A130 Fair Information Practice Principles, or for privacy pros, we call them the FIPPs. For security pros, it gets a little confusing sometimes because you think of FIPPs as with one P, and that's, Federal Information Processing Standards. So when we talk about FIPPs, we're talking about the two Ps. These largely come from OECD FIPPs. You can kind of see them articulated a little bit differently in different jurisdictions, but largely we're just putting them out there for you to recognize, and we'll focus a lot on, I think, what we think are sort of our favorite fair information practice principles and how they relate to digital identity. So think about things like data minimization, use limitation, purpose specification. A lot of these principles go hand in hand. And now to Zach for the regulatory landscape.
So when it comes to privacy, there's a lot of different regulations out there. I think everybody here knows about GDPR in the EU. It's often considered the most rigorous one and often the most talked about. Canada, Brazil, and China also have national laws when it comes to privacy. In the US, we have, of course, taken a different approach to it. We have a sector-by-sector and a state-by-state approach. On the financial market, you have Graham, Leach, Bliley, and SOX. For healthcare, you got HIPAA. And for kids and students, you have FERPA and COPA. States also have their own privacy legislation, with Illinois, California, Colorado, Utah, Virginia, and Tennessee having different legislation. There are also several bills pending in different state legislatures out there. There's been a lot of discussion in the last couple of years about a U.S. federal privacy law. I would say the odds of that happening are probably about 50-50. And, if you're in Vegas, you might like those odds, but I don't know if you like them when you're coming to legislation. Biometrics has been a very hot topic when it comes to identity technology as well. BIPA, the Biometric Information and Privacy Act in Illinois, has cost companies hundreds of millions of dollars. One would think that a law that has caught so many companies, the compliance would be fairly rigorous. In my mind, I don't think that it really is. You have these 4 things that you need to do in order to comply with BIPA, and that's develop a biometric collection and retention policy, biometric consent and approval form, verify and document that the biometric data is secure, and then create a written schedule for biometric data cleanup. You do those 4 things, you're good with BIPA. If you don't do those 4 things, you're going to find yourself in hot water. Also, these 4 things are just kind of a general best practice when it comes to identity and using identity technology as well, even outside of biometrics. Hot topic as of late is age verification legislation. So Utah and Arkansas have passed legislation that is going to require age verification for access to social media sites. Arkansas, Utah, Louisiana, and a handful of other states are also considering similar legislation for access to sites with adult content. The problem is there's no digital identity infrastructure in the US in order to do this. What we're going to have is people sending in digital images of their driver's license and their kids' birth certificates into social media sites. And while all of these laws have provisions in there saying that, hey, as soon as you get this information, you verify it, you gotta delete it. We've all worked at companies, we've all worked places. It's not gonna happen. We're gonna lead to more PII getting out there. I don't want my kid's birth certificate information out there because, one of the most common static KVA questions out there is, what city were you born in? So that said, I know this is going to be discussed a little bit more in my colleague Jeremy Grant's session on Friday at 9 a.m., the Can You See a National Digital Identity Strategy? So please make sure to check that out. Also, I forgot to mention in the previous slide, there's going to be another session on BIPA tomorrow afternoon. Brian Tangle, one of our colleagues who is an attorney, will be actually presenting on that one. So check that one out as well.
Okay, we'll move on to operationalizing privacy. I guess the last thing on that last slide, that article that was snapshot Zach was quoted in that CyberScoop article, so check it out. So now we're going to move on to operationalizing privacy through the lens of the Fair Information. Oh, we'll first talk a little bit more about some NIST concepts in framing privacy risk. So Ivy talked about some of the privacy harms. The concept presented in a NIST privacy risk assessment methodology, this is also found in the NIST privacy framework, is you have a problem that arises from the data processing. Let's say it ends up being an unauthorized disclosure that individual might experience. They experience the direct impact. Maybe it's embarrassing information. And then that impact results to the organization, and that can accrue in a variety of different things, including fines due to noncompliance, customer abandonment, or just generally loss of trust. And then I'm sure all of you are familiar with the cybersecurity, the security triad: confidentiality, availability, and integrity. NIST also has privacy triad: predictability, manageability, and disassociability. The last one is a bit of a mouthful, but there are definitely objectives you want to think about as you're designing systems. Predictability, enabling reliable assumptions by individuals about their data processing. That's accomplished through a variety of different mechanisms, whether it's, it's kind of how you communicate with your consumer, for example, about how you're processing their data. Manageability, related, how are you allowing individuals to manage their own data through the identity process? And then that last one, disassociability, what kind of techniques are you using to disassociate the data from the individual? So think about things like differential privacy that could be applied in certain use cases to mitigate risk. Then now moving on to principles in action again. There they are again. So lovely. We're going to try to make them actionable. I think that's one criticism of privacy, is that it's very policy-oriented. So I think our goal here is to try to break it down, and maybe for the engineers in the room, give you something to go back and think about how you can apply the principles in practice. So authority. So using my civil service time, this is often about, does the agency have the legal authority to collect the information in the first place? You'll see this. How many people remember filling out a Form I-9 when you're entering employment? Yeah, you might not actually read all the little disclaimers and notices, but there will be something on the form that says what the legal authority is for collecting the information in the first place. They also tie really closely with purpose, specification, and use limitations. And so that's for a federal use case. If you were talking about EU context, within GDPR, you've got 6 legal bases: consent, contract, legal obligation, vital interest, public task, legitimate interest. I think one misconception is that you always have to get consent to process the data under GDPR, and that's actually not the case. You've got 6 legal bases, and consent is but one of them. Some do's and don'ts here. You always want to consult with your privacy and legal teams to ensure your data processing is authorized. Don't assume that you have the authority to collect the information without doing that check first. And then, of course, obtain consent when necessary.
Right, the next fair information practice principle is transparency. If you're more used to the OECD guidelines or GDPR, you may see this phrased as openness. So this is just being transparent about privacy practices, providing clear and accessible notice regarding the creation, collection, use, processing, storage, maintenance, dissemination, and disclosure of personal data. So be transparent, be open, be honest. The ways that this looks in practice is clear notice, and you can do this through UI and UX. Make your privacy policies easy to find. Don't hide them in your website. Don't make them .4 font. Make them something that is user-friendly. Privacy impact assessments, or DPIAs, can also be a tool for transparency. An example from the public sector, all federal government agencies are required to publish their completed PIAs. This provides some great information. So who flew here? One of my favorite PIA examples out there is actually through the TSA, through DHS, and it's the body scanners in the airport. We've all interacted with them, especially if you fly frequently. We've probably all had questions, and you can go and see the original PIAs. They'll tell you exactly how the pilot went. They can tell you the different types of technologies they considered and exactly the privacy risks that they have identified and how they've been mitigated. They update those PIAs every 4 years, so you can even see what has changed with that type of technology as they're being used in the airports. It's pretty fascinating stuff. The only caveat with publishing your PIAs and DPIAs is letting the public know what they should know and then keeping certain things private. There may be some proprietary issues you may want to avoid, and then there may also be some unmitigated privacy risks that you're working towards that you may not want to let people be privy to just yet. And similar to publishing your PIAs, publicly available reports and public statements. You may not want to publish those PIAs in full. You can provide summaries, or you can provide overarching reports of exactly how your products and services are privacy preserving or privacy promoting. So do's and don'ts. Let individuals know how you handle their data in user-friendly ways. Make them easy to find, use some plain language. Don't change data processing practices without evaluating the need to update your notices. That should go without too much explanation. If a process changes, you add new data elements, or you decide that you want to use that information for something different, at least tell people about it. So thinking of privacy pro tips and those PMD objectives, think of predictability. Give individuals information about how their personal data is being used and allow them to make choices about their personal data. So quick pop quiz. What are some examples of transparency? A product privacy notice, a sign indicating CCTV recording is in place, or just a generic statement about respectful data use? Feel free to shout it out. Hearing both A's and B's, and that's correct. Product privacy notice is a great way to be transparent. It allows you to go beyond a generic privacy notice for your entire enterprise and be specific about one particular product that you offer and how personal data is involved. And something as simple as a sign for CCTV, it's transparent. It lets people know exactly what's going to happen. If you stay in this area, your activities and your image will be captured. Allow them to make a choice about their personal data. The next FIPP that we have is purpose specification. So inform individuals of the purposes for which personal data is processed. This goes a couple steps beyond transparency and kind of gets down to the why. Why do you need personal data? Why are you collecting it? Why are you retaining it? So in practice, we have notice to a user explaining the purpose for data processing. So think of that throughout the entire data lifecycle. Why are you collecting it? Why are you processing it? How are you processing it? Purpose and use limitations can also be defined in law. So we talked about biometrics a little bit earlier. You can go to the BIPA session tomorrow with Brian Tangle and learn about those legal restrictions that may be on how you can or cannot use certain types of data elements for certain purposes. And then also contract language. It may be someone giving you their data or you giving your data to another service provider or vendor. You need to be specific. Don't allow them to use it for a secondary purpose because that might put someone else in hot water. So do's and don'ts, let individuals know about the purposes for their personal data. Don't provide vague or blanket statements that allow for flexibility. We should all have a good why behind our business decisions, and that goes for personal data as well. So for digital identity, just pay extra attention to any concepts that have to deal with user trust and their data.
Use limitation. This is an interesting one because in the US, this is kind of run amok a little bit. So you have, think about driver's license, social security number. Social security number is only supposed to be used to enable you to access social security benefits. It is, for lack of a better term, a de facto national identity number. There's no way around it. Driver's license. I am permitted to drive this automobile. Nope. You show it when you, I'm sure all of you pulled out your driver's license when you checked into the hotel today. We definitely have a problem with use limitation in the US. The idea is to try and get that more under control. You need to put policies and procedures in place to kind of limit who has access to data and how that data is used. Also limit how third parties can share that data and how that data might be used in contract language. Basically, some of the do's: safeguard data against unauthorized use, consult with privacy and legal teams to make sure that any use is permissible, and then make sure you receive updated consent from individuals before using data for new purposes. Don't assume that new use cases are covered without talking to your privacy and legal team, and don't collect identity data for one purpose and then use it for another.
I just want to add a couple anecdotes because I think purpose and use limitation are probably two of the most foundational things for digital identity. And so one federal use case example, I was the privacy officer for E-Verify for about 3 years. And so that's an example where they had a specific legal authority to process personal data to verify employment eligibility. And that was the authorizing statute, so that was the authority, that was the purpose stated. That means that that data could not be used for other purposes. Of course, it did not stop other entities from coming to DHS to ask for that data, but the answer to that was, you know, there's a restriction, there's a use limitation here, and it's an important use limitation in practice. A case kind of ripped from the headlines where we had Twitter that captured information for multi-factor authentication purposes, and they got in hot water because they repurposed that data to target advertising, resulting in a really huge fine. So that's something to think about. I know use limitation in the identity space creates a lot of friction for identity professionals because it's like, well, we've got the data, like why can't we just use it? Same with, you know, some of the agencies that Zach mentioned, like Social Security Administration. It's because they have a specific authorizing statute and use limitations are built in. You know, one example of how they opened that up a little bit was the electronic consent-based verification system, which was for permitted entities in financial institutions. There's, I think, appetite in industry to open that up even broader, but there you have an agency that says, you know, we were created to administer Social Security benefits, not, you know, we're not an identity provider, but, you know, I think from our perspective in Better Identity Coalition, we wish that SSA would kind of sort of accept its role a little bit more there in more targeted ways. And
Definitely.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, okay, that's right. Sorry. And then the other really, I think, impactful privacy principle to consider in digital identity, and really like kind of any privacy, is data minimization. I mean, because after all, if you don't collect it, you don't have to protect it. And it also, like, you know, all these kind of anecdotes we're telling you about these privacy principles, some of them sort of disappear. If you're not collecting the information in the first place, you don't have to worry about any use limitation or, you know, do I have authority to use it? Do I have appropriate security controls in place? So data minimization shows up in a lot of different ways in practice. You can see them in the NIST digital identity guidelines when you're talking about the identity proofing process, collecting the minimum set of attributes that are necessary to perform the task. Doesn't mean that you can't collect data. It just basically is asking organizations to really think deeply about what you're collecting and the purpose for why you're collecting it.
Yeah, when I was supporting a state integrated eligibility program, we were building a new enrollment module, and I was looking at the flows and the data elements that we were going to be collecting, and I was like, why are we collecting all this information? And I was the we weren't a big enough team to where there was a privacy folks on it. I was cybersecurity. I'm like, why are we collecting all this information? We just got to protect it. And they're like, because we can. And that's the wrong answer. That is that, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I don't know if the engineers in this room will disagree with me, but security and privacy often butt heads with developers and architects because we kind of try to rein them in. And this was definitely an instance. And luckily, I was able to go back to the privacy officer at the agency, and we were able to get them to scale back the number of data elements that we're collecting.
And then I guess, you know, we've got lots of do's and don'ts here, but just another thing in practice that I think is often forgotten about, you mentioned it in the biometrics slide, retention schedule. How many people are familiar with their organization's retention schedules? Like literally a handful went up. That's like a minimized response right there. It's really important, like retention and deletion schedules, because again, if you're holding on to data that you shouldn't be holding on to, that's not a good practice in general. You kind of expose yourself to a variety of different risks. So you want to be asking those questions about like, what is the schedule for this? And if it's not, like, who do you talk to within your organization to establish a reasonable retention schedule? True or false? Deletion is the only way to truly accomplish data minimization. False. That is correct. There are a lot of different mechanisms you can use to to achieve data minimization, some of which we just talked about. De-identification could be one, short retention schedules, even thinking about for identity purposes, sometimes we want to hold on to that transaction data for a certain period. You even want to look at your retention schedule and try to develop one that's, the minimum necessary to accomplish that purpose. Steve.
I don't mean to have the chairs for all or anything like that. Minimization doesn't mean zero, right? So I often engage with engineers who think the Privacy Act is banning them from gathering email addresses. And I think I'm right. I'm not a lawyer, but I'd like to say to people that the Privacy Act in Australia, at least, and GDPR, does not ban anything. It just says don't collect information that you don't need.
I think that is correct. I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, it's like I always said as a privacy professional, one of my favorite sayings is not really trying to put the no in innovation. I just want to work with you to figure out what you need to accomplish your purpose. You can do it in a more streamlined fashion. You probably can make a better user experience too if you're asking your users to supply a minimum set of attributes versus filling out the whole form. If you're presenting with this form with all this data, you're going to have a lot of questions about why do you need all this, and you might not trust the process and you might abandon it.
Data quality and integrity. So, there's an old saying in data management, garbage in, garbage out. So you basically, this whole thing is you want to make sure that the data that you're taking in is valid, to make sure that it's good data. There's varying spectrums of this. Like if you're trying to get a 20% off coupon at a website, validating an email address is good enough. If you're trying to identity proof someone so that they can get their tax returns, you want to do make them jump through a few more hoops. But you want to make sure you have the data to basically be able to validate and verify that information. Some of the do's with data integrity and quality is, you have to reconsider redress processes if inaccurate determinations have been made. You need to consider studies and metrics on data quality, and this is something that you should do frequently. Don't make automated determinations about individuals in situations where data quality issues exist. Last, you have to consider equity and inclusion, especially with what we're hearing everything about biometrics these days, and making sure that the solutions are equitable and inclusive. I know a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how to best do that, especially in a real world environment. But this is all stuff that you have to watch when it comes to data quality and integrity.
Okay, individual participation. This one is also a really important privacy principle for identity professionals. It can be as basic as the mechanism you're using for collecting the information from the individual. For U.S. federal sector, the Privacy Act of 1974 really encourages collection directly from the individual when it impacts an individual's rights, benefits, or privileges. This can manifest in consents. Also, just sort of the basic concept about I as the individual want to exercise control over my own data. That underlies things in GDPR and all of the state privacy laws that you're seeing. It's like the right to access information about yourself, to correct it, amend it. GDPR, you can delete the data. This is a right that's actually been in place for the Privacy Act of 1974. Since 1974, you can make a Privacy Act request and ask a federal agency to show you the data that it holds about you in its records. You can request amendment if necessary. All kind of articulations of the individual participation principle. So you definitely want to give people control over their information when possible. That can be through enabling mechanisms like, not just the I consent to this, more kind of selective disclosure processing permissions are things to think about when you're designing an identity solution. And establishing a repeatable process to respond to requests with the patchwork of state privacy laws. I think almost all of them include data subject access requests or individual requests. So you want to make sure that you have a robust process in place. But also, in some cases, you're going to want to include identity verification for those requests, especially if the individual is asking for release of sensitive information about themselves. Kind of on the flip side of that, you might not want to include identity verification processes to, for example, process opt-out requests, because of course you don't want to make the individual supply more information. Let's say they signed up for a marketing list. They really shouldn't have to prove who they are to opt out of something like that. True or false? When collecting personal data, it is always necessary to obtain consent from the individual. Sarah, I think that's a fair. I think you want to yes, the answer is false. For GDPR, as we talked about in the beginning, consent is one of the 6 legal bases, but you could have another legal basis for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, we start to see privacy laws. I'm coming from Canada. We start to see privacy laws that say we want to be GDPR 2.0, and that we will remove those other not requiring consent use cases to consume PI, and say consent is required whatever you want to do. So it's always going to be a little bit. So maybe it would become true at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could consider it in a best practice. I think if it's not legally required, you want to evaluate kind of what is the benefit to the individual capturing the consent, as well as what's the benefit to the organization. Sometimes more granular consent will give the organization more confidence that they can use it for one purpose or maybe multiple purposes. Oh, and then we got a GDPR slide sprinkled in there. So if it's an EU use case, for example, GDPR specifies when you do require consent, this is the guidance around it. It's got to be freely given, specific, so no vague, consent notices. Has to be unambiguous with clear and plain language. And then I think, kind of for the engineers to think about too, if you're working with GDPR, you need to be able to maintain proof of consent. So like a record of consent, you want to be able to capture and maintain it for, like, if a regulator comes a knocking, you're going to want to be able to demonstrate that you have those records to show that you obtain consent. And then revocability is also a really important thing here.
And we are at a security conference, so we can't let pass without talking about security safeguards. So, I would say my experience is cybersecurity and privacy people when working in practice kind of are often viewed as kind of the buzzkill. Like, we sometimes are the no in innovation. That's been my experience, sadly. But, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. When it comes down to it, my background's in cybersecurity, but working with Jamie and Ivy for the last year plus, I've definitely learned a whole lot more about privacy. It's been great, but basically follow best practices. Have policies, processes, and procedures in place. On how you handle your data. You need to have physical and logical access controls, and the big thing is encrypt. Use encryption and use good encryption. Apply the CSF and work with your security and privacy team. Don't there's privacy by design, security by design. Don't include your security and privacy team at the last minute. You need to have them embedded with your team throughout the development process of applications so that you don't run into any problems down the road. And that's pretty much about it for that one.
And thanks for sticking with us. Our last FIPP is accountability. So remain accountable for implementing all of these principles that we've been discussing today and all of the different and various mechanisms for supporting those principles. You can do this in a variety of ways, including your privacy governance structures. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to privacy, so no two privacy offices are necessarily going to look the same. Might include designating a privacy officer, having a DPO to demonstrate legal compliance, or having an oversight board that shares privacy responsibilities. You can align yourself more with transparency through those public reports. You can implement auditing practices. You can include contract provisions, and you can also do certification practices. So our big do's and don'ts are allocating sufficient resources to implement your privacy activities, and considering this principle when you think of every other fair information practice principle. And the don't is don't overcommit your privacy role. A few people raised your hands when we asked how many people wear a couple of hats. This kind of goes the same way. It's like you got to be committed to performing these privacy activities, but don't spread it too thin. It is everyone's responsibility to protect privacy, and everyone's unique perspectives on what is important and how to protect personal data really helps enrich privacy in your organization. And then moving to scenario.
All right, I think we go to the next
Here's
slide.
the fun part, right?
Yeah, this is the fun part. So we have a scenario. We want you all to help us participate and kind of come up with this. And so we have a scenario I'm going to read through, or you all can start reading, that we want to find out which FIPPs are relevant and how they're relevant. So the scenario is a new law requiring age verification and parental consent for individuals between 13 and 17 goes into effect in July 2024. Your product team must find a way to implement this new requirement, but also must address privacy concerns expressed about capturing sensitive data from minors. Leveraging what you've learned about the FIPPs in practice, how would you apply privacy protections to enabling this type of age verification? So what are some of the FIPPs that would be relevant, and how are they relevant? Do we want to...
Can you say?
I'm going to put you on the spot. Hold on, let me get down. Who said it? Who says use?
It would be important to be very clear about what the use limitation is, why you are collecting this data. I don't know if that's purpose specification or use limitation, but why you're going to use it, and then how long you're going to retain it, what, how you're going to protect it, dispose of it, all that good stuff.
I think that's both use limitation and purpose specification.
Yeah.
What other FIPPs would be relevant to this use case, this scenario? Mike.
I'll start with authority. It's a law, so the organization has that authority to comply with the law, but they need to disclose how they're going to do that.
Did I hear someone over here?
I was going to say authority as well, but authority also comes from the authority from the consent itself, in a sense that also contributes to the authority aspect, I think. Yeah.
So for data minimization, you only want to collect the bare minimum that you need, especially when it comes to minors?
Only we had online use cases for mobile driver's licenses at this point. So close. Who else? I think maybe be able to get a state ID and be able to do that. Anyone else? Should we open up for questions, Jamie?
Yeah, or just more generally, what kind of privacy protections would you build in if you had to build this? Go ahead. Use limitation.
Happy to.
I'd say data quality and integrity for making sure that that data is communicated securely between the parent in this and the organization who's asking for consent.
I'm sorry, I have a side question, but in this case, we are requiring parental consent for that, and the relationship in between a minor and an adult is by itself a PI. So there will be into the overall things, how do I acquire this relationship in between the minor and the adult person? I don't have an answer for that.
Honestly, with this whole use case, that's one of the trickier things. How do they know that I am a parent to my child? I guess if I have the birth certificate, that's one thing. But who's to say that I didn't break into somebody's house and steal the birth certificate? It's difficult. It's definitely a tricky subject. Other questions? Other thoughts?
And I'm not a COPPA expert, but that could be one model to look at when you're looking for verifiable parental consent, is they'll have a separate mechanism. They'll request a second email address. They'll delay when they send it. They'll have a different mechanism for sending it back. You have to fax it back or email it back or send a picture to a different phone number or address. So it's they're trying to proxy, how do I know this is a different person? But that's where we are with COPPA. Again, not an attorney, not a COPPA expert.
But yeah, I guess this is a scenario. It's a fictitious scenario, but it's a scenario many of our organizations are going to have to grapple with if these laws pass. So just some food for thought. If it were to come to pass, just remember these privacy principles and mechanisms you can take into account to build a more privacy-preserving identity solution for this type of use case.
I think I can't remember if I mentioned it or not. There is a pending law in the U.S. Senate that would do the age verification as well. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know the exact number for this, but there is also age verification systems international standards development being done in SC 27. Again, I don't know the number for it. It's still under development, but it is on everyone's radar screen.
We have like 1 or 2 minutes.
I think we're almost at time, so we can open it up for questions, but we can also kind of hang back after if folks want to come chat. Any burning questions? You're all privacy pros now.
So you talk about the data leaks and the problem of data leaks. How can we make sure that if one organization is evaluating the privacy risk, it's not just for themselves? If I leak your SSN, I might create problems into other organizations that trying to protect this SSN, but use this information for other purposes. So do you know inside the risk modelization and all of that way to be able to encompass this information?
I mean, if you look at, for example, like NIST privacy risk assessment methodology, it talks about the different types of ways to mitigate risk, and sometimes it's transferring the risk, and that could be through contracts. Having provisions for, if you're sharing data with a third party, what the permitted uses are, potentially what the consequences are. Essentially kind of putting rules in place and not just sharing the data freely without any restriction. And maybe even having some sort of auditing mechanism on the back end can help with that, with accountability as well.
Well, thank you all. We're around all week. Please find us if